crop. If we can grow corn and beans, we sure as heck can grow rye. It just takes different skills.
I think there's study after study that shows that diversity on the landscape yields benefits.
Our longer rotation, our diverse rotation, should help us with our soil fertility. The small grains do a good job of scavenging nutrients. The cover that comes underneath the small grains will be contributing to fertility for next year's crop as well. In addition, the green manure that's going to be coming up underneath these oats should contribute to our organic matter, should raise our organic matter and improve our soil health altogether.
The diversity is both a challenge, but it's also very rewarding. Just to learn something new about a different crop, understand why, we get kind of caught into this whole corn soybean paradigm that's all we believe we can do. And the reality is there's a lot of other opportunities out there if we ask the right questions and look around a little bit.
I think any way we can enhance the diversification of cropping systems with deep-rooted species that offer near continuous living cover is going to come out a net winner for Iowa.
For many Iowa farmers like Tim Searin of Keota, the decision to add a small grains crop like rye, wheat, oats, or barley to their rotations came from seeing the benefits of cover crops to their farm operations and wanting to expand them.
Well, the main small grain I grow is rye, and the main reason I grow it is for erosion control. Because you can see the kind of ground I got a lot of rolling hills, I got a lot of C and D slopes, and so it's a way I've found that you can get some cover on the hills to hold the soil in place in the spring when you get them heavy spring rains. That's the main reason I started growing it. But after I started growing rye, well, then I found out that it makes good cow forage, and got to the point where I started seeding 100% of my acres down. So then I decided that I could probably grow it myself since I was needing more seed. So that's kind of how we got into growing it for harvest. So one thing just kind of led to another, and it just, the longer you do it, the more uses you can find for it, and the more versatile it is. So it works out for about anything.
The grain that I produce here for small grains, I did oats and rye this year. All of that is used either on our farm or on neighboring farms. We have several farmers in our area that are getting into cover crops a lot bigger than they used to, and so they have demand, and they'd much rather buy it from their local neighbor than from a seed company. It's a matter of convenience, and it's a matter of just good neighborliness.
I guess the reason we decided to use the small grains, the way they fit for us is it gives us a lot more time to do a cover crop. We can plant the cover crop in July, get a lot of biomass, and then we graze it with cattle. Our cattle, it'll feed them rather economically the whole winter, or we try to as much as we can. They don't get it all. They trample about half, so that goes back into the soil to feed the microbes, plus they do a good job spreading the manure and whatnot. But I realized as I kept working with cover crops, there is just not enough time to get a lot of biomass, and we cannot get the diversity with just doing a cover crop between corn and soybeans. And so that's why we went to the wheat.
The worst part with small grains is that since nobody grows them around our area anymore, I couldn't just go and ask my neighbors for recommendations or, hey, how do you do this? Or what's a good piece of equipment to get, because none of them know it anymore. The guys that grew small grains here, they're in their 80s. You know, what they remember is they haven't grown it in 40 years themselves, so a lot of the stuff they knew they've forgotten.
Because crops like oats haven't been grown on large acreages in Iowa in over a generation, it can be hard to know where to start. At Practical Farmers of Iowa, we've been at work over the past couple years trying to put together the knowledge that's still out there on growing more diverse crops in the landscape. In this series, we'll share some of what we found out. We'll talk a little bit about what rotationally raised means and a little about the history of small grains in Iowa and why many farmers across the state are looking to grow the crops again. More importantly, we'll share practical experiences from farmers across the state on how to successfully and profitably grow small grains. Throughout the series, we'll talk about rotations, variety selection, seed bed preparation, planting, crop protection, harvest, storage, marketing, and more. So why is there so little knowledge out there on how to grow small grains successfully? Well, Northeast Iowa farmer Earl Canfield has spent a lot of time figuring out how he can diversify his family's farm operation. And that search for knowledge has led him back in time.
If you would go back in time in Iowa, including on this farm, so our farm here, it has been owned and managed by members of the Canfield family for 150 years now. As you can see, I'm wearing a t-shirt that celebrates the fact that we were awarded a Heritage Farm Award this year by the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship in conjunction with Farm Bureau. Anyway, if we were to go back several generations in time on our farm, as with most farms, we would find there was a time where there was a very diverse mixture of crops growing on the farm. You had, in almost every growing season, you would have oats growing, you would have one or more types of hay crops growing, you would have permanent pastures growing for livestock to graze on, you would have some row crops, typically corn. You might have some other small grains like some wheat or some barley growing on small portions of different fields. We were the #1 producer of oats in 1950 nationwide in Iowa with over 6 million acres of oats. If you look at the production of oats then in the years that followed after that, if you look at it on a graph or a chart, you'll notice that there was it peaked and plateaued there in 1950. And then it started to gradually decline throughout the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s and rapidly dropped off to almost nothing by the early to mid 1980s. And so then we have to ask, so where did the oat production go? Because there are still oats used in Iowa today. People still use them to feed livestock. They're still used for milling for like your oatmeal and other human food grade products that are produced and sold in grocery stores. Where do those oats come from today if they're not being raised in Iowa? Well, predominantly oat production moved from Iowa and other states surrounding Iowa to the northern plains into South Dakota, North Dakota, and then it gradually continued to move into Canada. So today, most of the oat production that is consumed here in the Midwest or even nationwide is the oats are grown in Canada, in the western provinces, central and western provinces of Canada, and then also in the Dakotas. And so as production of oats moved out of Iowa, we not only lost a local source for that grain product for the end users of that product, but farmers lost the opportunity to be able to grow a crop like that on their land and see their land benefit from all of the good things that happen when you have the crop diversity on your farm that allows you to be growing a crop like oats and allows you to be growing companion crops that typically would have gone with it, like alfalfa and clover and other mixtures of legumes and grasses that were typically grown and turned into hay for feeding livestock.
Livestock is probably still the single biggest reason that farmers in Iowa grow small grains, but end uses of the crop have shifted a little bit. Many farmers, like Earl, still use oats as a nurse crop for hay establishment, and many still use the grain for livestock feed and the straw for bedding. But increasingly, small grains have not only served as cover crops themselves. Tim and Wade, along with many others, grow rye for seed. Because small grains are harvested in July, farmers really have the opportunity to plant a very diverse mix of cover crops that can grow in the warm weather in August and early September and really unlock a lot of the benefits that cover crops have to offer. While many times these diverse mixes are planted as livestock feed, pretty much everyone is after the same thing, and that's improving the soil.
It really allows us to plant pretty much whatever we want as far as cover crops go after a small grain harvest, and that's what got me interested in it initially, kind of growing our own small grain for our own use, harvesting it in July, and saving that seed either to feed or for planting somewhere else the following year. And after you have that harvested off, the world is your oyster as far as species that you can plant for cover crops, and really start to get into a lot of diversity for species and for roots for your soil.
So our cover crop mix, we were interested in a couple goals. We wanted forage for our livestock. We wanted to be able to fix some nitrogen for our corn crop that's going to follow this. And we wanted to have a really diverse mix of species. We wanted some flowering species, some grass species with some different rooting patterns that allow us to do different things within the soil profile. And so we have a diverse mix of cover crops here that hopefully allow us to meet those goals.
The main goal, and this is kind of our long-term goal, 5 to 10 year goal, is to increase the water holding capacity of that soil, increase the nutrient holding capacity of that soil, and also to give our soil biology something to eat, something to function on for as many months out of the year as possible.
Particularly in a no-till or reduced tillage type of cropping system, you can get nutrient stratification where applied nutrients remain at the top and soil nutrients remain deeper in the ground. And so having those different rooting patterns as well as the different associations with soil microbes can allow those nutrients from deeper in the ground to be pulled up by a deep-rooted plant, converted into residue, crop residue, that's then broken down on top of the soil surface and decomposed on top of the ground. And so you have that exchange of nutrients from deeper in the profile to shallower in the profile. And that, as it breaks down into organic matter, can allow us to absorb more water, hold more water, have better infiltration, and also will recycle some nutrients back to us for years to come.
If you study the components of what is required to have healthy soil on your farm, first and foremost, you have to understand that soil is a very diverse mixture of a lot of different things. You've got minerals in the soil, you've got organic matter, you've got water, you've got air. But for a long time, one of the critical pieces that's been neglected and oftentimes missing in most farm fields, including ours, is having a proper and healthy balance of bacteria and fungi and all of the other microbial life in the soil that are required to create soil structure, that are required to release nutrients so that plants can use them, that are required to basically maintain all of the components in the soil profile that are necessary to allow it to be productive for plants, that allow it to be held in place when you get heavy rainstorms instead of washing off the field. Oats, really any type of green plant growing on a field as much of the time as possible, as long as it's putting roots into the soil profile, is going to provide the environment that's necessary for the right mixture of different types of microbial life to thrive and to prosper there. And as that happens, they start to build health back into the soil.
Crop residues, manures, and other organic matter amendments serve as food for soil microorganisms, and if you apply more food, more things come to eat. Diverse communities of microbes typically have a lot of redundancy. You have things doing more or less the same thing, but the idea is that the community is better able to provide the health and nutrient cycling functions and the soil building functions when it has a better diet.
Matt Liebman is the Henry A. Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State University and a professor of agronomy there. And he spent the last 15 years studying the differences between corn and soybean rotations and longer rotations that include oats, clover, alfalfa, and integrate livestock manure.
The kinds of things that microbes consume are diverse, and we supply diverse feedstuffs in the form of clover and alfalfa residues, crop residues from the oat crop in the more diverse rotations differ from just the corn and soybean residues we'd be applying. Manure itself contains healthy amounts of microbes, but also contains quite a bit of carbon and other nutrients that serve as substrates for those microbes to consume. So by adding food to the soil, we stimulate populations of microbes. They initially consume the carbon and the nutrients, and then as they die off, they release those nutrients back into plant available form. In the process of living in the soil and building their colonies and communities, they alter soil structure, and they can create a more crumb-like structure, better tilth, more airspace. And we've seen reductions in what we call bulk density, the amount of air in a given volume of soil, and that allows easier penetration of roots into the soil, and it also allows greater exchange of oxygen, which roots need to respire in the soil.
Over the last, 5 or 6 years, we've kind of gone from having our nice day-long rains where we'd get 3/4 of an inch to an inch to having 3 inches in 4 hours. It's really important to be able to suck that water into the moisture instead of it running off or infiltrating straight through to the water table. Really important to be able to absorb that water and hold it, especially for the June and July and August months when you need the water the most and when you're really begging for a rain. We need to really be able to position ourselves to take advantage of these extreme weather patterns. This year we had a really wet May, and June turned out to be hot and dry for the whole month. And if your soil has that capacity to hold that moisture that it collects in April, May, and have it available for that growing crop during the month of June, that's priceless. In a perennial growing crop like a pasture, your organic matter, of course, is going to be higher. And so you're able to hold a lot more water. And there are actual studies out there that you can find on the internet that will tell you, for every increase in percent of organic matter, you gain this many gallons of water holding capacity per acre. So really, if we start looking at the value of 1% organic matter based on water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity, you can start to put actual numbers to your balance sheet.
Soils that are well structured, the way you get that kind of crumbly tilth that occurs after organic matter amendments and diverse rotation crops have been produced for a number of years, those soils are better with regard to the rates of rainfall infiltrating into the soil. Once it gets into the soil, the availability of water in the soil proper is encouraged by organic matter through a variety of processes. But basically the pore structure in the soil and the organic matter release of moisture makes more water available as organic matter in the soil goes up. So the two of those things together, more water going into the soil running off, and more water once it's in the soil being available to the crop, means that organic matter is an important way to buffer the soil against drought.
But it's not just about improving soil productivity and water holding capacity. Small grains, green manures, forages, and cover crops all serve as ways that farmers can keep their soil, water, and nutrients on their farm.
We want to keep the soil in place. My wife balances our checkbook and checks the credit card statements, and if we could check our soil statement, we like to see it staying in place and increasing and not letting it go down the river and not getting any benefit for it.
As small grains, again, they're a cool season crop that's getting started very early in the spring, and so there's roots in the ground, living roots in the ground before your corn or soybean plants are growing. And also at a time of year where we start to get a lot of rain in that April, early May time frame, that weed is already up and growing. It's able to utilize that moisture, number one, but it's also protecting the soil and holding nutrients in or taking nutrients up, so we're not losing as many nutrients to leaching, and we're not losing as much soil off the top to erosion.
I've worked with Mark Tomer from the USDA lab here, and we've looked at the quality of water draining through the soil underneath these plots. And we found that the 4-year rotation that includes alfalfa decreases the concentrations of nitrogen below the crops considerably. We get a 25 to 30% reduction in nitrate concentrations. Alfalfa is very good at scavenging nitrogen out of the soil. It's got a deep root. Its canopy is active from early spring to late in the fall, so it's actively transpiring water and preventing water from leaking through the soil profile because that water carries nitrogen.
To get a better grip on how these water quality issues came about, it can be helpful to look back to the history of Iowa's crop ground.
As Iowa has lost more and more acres of crops being grown that are grown in a solid seeded manner, like small grains are grown or hay is grown, every time that happens on an additional field, that's one more part of a local watershed that is losing the benefits that come to that watershed from having a solid seeded crop growing on a field and preventing the soil and the nutrients that are in that soil from washing off of the field when you have heavy rain events and ending up in surface waters.
Jerry Hatfield is the director of the National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment, which is a USDA research center in Ames. And he and some colleagues conducted a research study in 2009 that evaluated land use in the Raccoon River watershed over the past 75 years. And that's one of the rivers that supplies drinking water for the city of Des Moines. And as you can see, the amount of small grains and hay acres declined dramatically in that watershed, as they did really in the rest of the state. But at the same time, the amount of nitrates in the river at the city of Des Moines has increased. Earl, as many other farmers, sees diverse crop rotation as a way to solve that problem.
Part of the reason we have that problem today, and a potential viable solution to that problem, is helping farmers in the state create an economy again where it is profitable for farmers on a large scale, not just a few farmers, but many farmers all over the state being able to profitably grow a crop like oats again so that they can be growing it on their farm so that their soil can be receiving the benefits from that. And in turn then, those benefits that are growing on fields all over Iowa will have a direct impact on the watersheds that are naturally occurring all over Iowa that ultimately affect everyone that lives in the state, whether they're farmers or people that live off the land in our towns and cities.
Small grains could play a big role in the diversification of Iowa's farm businesses and landscapes. But it's really about more than just small grains. It's about figuring out how to raise crops grown in rotation. And so when we talk about rotationally raised, we're talking not only about the crops grown in rotation, like rotationally raised corn or rotationally raised soybeans. We're also talking about rotationally raised livestock that have been fed rotationally raised corn, beans, or small grains or hay. And taking that a step further, we can have rotationally raised food products made from rotationally raised crops. At Practical Farmers of Iowa, we've been working with Sustainable Food Lab, which is an association of food and beverage companies, to work up and down the agriculture supply chain to come up with solutions to ensure that our farms, communities, land, and water remain productive and healthy into the future. Over the next few months, we hope you'll tune in to learn how to diversify to make your farm sustainable, profitable, and strong. Next week, we'll learn how diversifying your crop rotation could allow you to reduce input costs and help tip net returns in your favor.